Welcome to Kant for Everyone on Philosophy for Everyday Life. I'm Jimmy. Hello. It looks like we have a couple of you here. Welcome. It is snowing on this gray Chicago morning, but it's cozy inside. So this is the third episode or installment in my series called Kant for Everyone, where more or less the idea is to read some or all of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant's most famous work and one of the most important works of Western philosophy. So here we are. I would like to get into the preface more directly today, but I want to review a couple of things I've said by way of context or setup, and maybe mention a few additional pieces of information. So one of the commentators who I read in a previous episode said that to tell the story of the influence of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is just to tell the story of the history of Western philosophy since Kant. I think this is true, and I think it bears repeating. If you want to understand modern Western philosophy, there are few more productive things you can do than to understand Kant better. So if that's a goal of yours, you're in the right place, I hope. I also want to suggest that many of us, perhaps most of us, have an inadequate understanding of Kant. For many years, at least, this was true of me. My understanding was inadequate, first, because it's very difficult to convey what Kant is really up to through a few lectures in an undergraduate course, even through reading his work as an undergraduate. When I really started reading Kant for myself, I had to unlearn most of what I thought I knew about him. My understanding was also inadequate because of what we might call intellectual presumption. I thought I knew what Kant had said, and that I was more or less in a position to dismiss it. This type of attitude toward Kant and other great philosophers is probably more common than it should be, even if it is understandable, for such is human nature. Be that as it may, I begin this episode by referring again to Theodor Adorno's opening conceit in his commentary on the first critique. He writes, "Let me begin with the fiction that you do not yet know anything about the critique of pure reason." I think this is a decent place for all of us to begin. So I spent the first two episodes of this series clearing my throat, more or less, so to speak. We dipped into several commentaries or discussions of the Critique of Pure Reason, including those of Peter Strawson, Martin Heidegger, Theodor Adorno, Norman Kemp Smith, and H.J. Paton. Other commentators will engage in the future include Gilles Deleuze, Henry Allison, and others. So I mentioned previously that Kant's work is often thought to be a synthesis of the two main streams of Western philosophy before Kant, rationalism and empiricism. And I will switch over to draw some things on the iPad now. Hopefully you can see that. The way I was taught is that we have rationalism and empiricism. We have Kant at the center of this X, and empiricism carries on in analytic philosophy, while rationalism carries on in continental philosophy. This is a pretty useful, handy framework for conceptualizing the whole of modern philosophy. Of course, in rationalism, we have figures like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and in empiricism, we have figures like Locke, Hume, and Berkeley. But I suggested that I would also like to read Kant against the backdrop of Aristotle's philosophy, as well as Augustinian Christianity, because I think Kant engages both of these traditions of thought quite directly and transformed both of them permanently. I'm reluctant to draw more lines on this diagram, but we could do something like this. Here we have Aristotle, and here we have Augustinian Christianity. I say Aristotle specifically because we know that the works of Aristotle were in Kant's library, and it seems when I read Kant with Aristotle in mind, it just seems like he's engaging with Aristotle directly. I say Augustinian Christianity because I think Kant is engaged with a broader tradition of Christian theology and thought, but not directly with Augustine. Augustine is kind of the progenitor of that tradition, but I'm not sure how directly Kant is engaged with Augustine himself. So I also noted that Kant reads all of these traditions of thought or streams of thought in the context of three intellectual crises, which are the rise of critical biblical scholarship, Newtonian physics, and Humean skepticism. Biblical criticism created a crisis for Augustinian Christianity by challenging the historicity of the events discussed or recorded in the Bible and the authenticity of the authorship of the Bible. So it raised the question, did these things actually happen? And were these texts actually written by the people that we always thought they were? Newtonian physics created a crisis for the previously regnant Aristotelian picture of the natural world. And Humean skepticism created a crisis not only for Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, but also for science and philosophy in general. And Kant addresses all of these crises simultaneously in his work. Finally, I noted that there is a really important distinction in Kant's thought, which is essential for understanding, I think, everything that he's up to. And I will put this on a different page. And that's the distinction between the empirical and the intelligible. And this distinction runs in parallel with a series of other terminological distinctions in Kant's work, such as those between the phenomenal and the noumenal, the a posteriori and the a priori, between appearances and things in themselves, as well as between natural science and what we might call pure philosophy. In the commentary by Adorno, he mentioned that Kant is not a subjectivist in the opening pages or paragraphs there. And I want to emphasize here, it's tempting to think that here's another distinction that would fit with Kant's work or with his thought. That the intelligible, the things in themselves, pure philosophy, this is the realm of objectivity. And that the empirical is the realm of subjectivity. And that is incorrect. Both of these areas are objective. So that's also important to keep in mind. I think if we fail to understand these distinctions and how they work in Kant's thought, we will misunderstand his thought as a whole. So I will keep emphasizing this. And it's just important to hold these distinctions in mind as we go. I also think these distinctions highlight how deeply Aristotelian and Augustinian Kant's thought is, We get this term things in themselves from Aristotle, or it appears first in Aristotle as far as I'm aware, maybe also in Plato. To my mind, a priori and a posteriori are categories from Aristotle's logic, mediated to Kant through his own lectures on logic and reading on logic, probably. But this distinction between two realms, an empirical and an intelligible, and Kant does use language like this sometimes, or two standpoints, also seems to me deeply Augustinian. And it goes back to Augustine's distinction between two cities, the city of God and the city of the world. I forget what he calls the second city. But this idea that reality has a deep kind of structure characterized by a distinction between a sort of intelligible and empirical realm or sphere. Of course, this goes back to Plato, but I think that the way it shows up in Kant is undeniably also downstream from Augustine. So if you're dubious about that claim, that's fine. Over time, I'll have, I think, more opportunity to explain why I think it's helpful as a framework for reading Kant. So that's all for background. In addition to these pieces of background information, I also discussed before the two primary English translations of Kant's First Critique. We have Kemp Smith's translation from 1933. I think it was, the first edition was 1928. And we have Geyer and Wood's translation from 1998. And the primary difference between these translations is that Geyer and Wood maintain, as far as I'm aware, and from what I understand from their preface, a one-to-one correspondence between specific words in Kant's German original and in their translation. Whereas Kemp Smith attempts to capture Kant's meaning by translating the same German word into different English words depending on context. So I indicated that I prefer Kemp Smith's translation for readability. And I also noted that I'm somewhat baffled by Geyer and Wood's decision to translate the German word Erkenntnis using the English word cognition. So we have this word Erkenntnis. Geyer and Wood use cognition, whereas Kemp Smith uses knowledge, which to me is the more obvious translation. Knowledge, to my mind, resonates with so much other writing in philosophy in a way that the word cognition just doesn't. And this word Erkenntnis shows up in the very first sentence of the preface to the first edition. I believe it's also in the first sentence of the first chapter of the book. And to use cognition there just strikes me as a miss, because it doesn't allow us to see how Kant is engaged, for example, with the opening lines of Aristotle's Metaphysics. Every man by nature desires to know, not to have cognition. But I thought more about why Geyer and Wood might have made this decision. And let me take us over to something else. So let's say we type in the word knowledge in English. What are the German options? Well, we do have Erkenntnis down here, but we also have Wissen, Kenntnisse, and Kenntnis. We have several options. So my assumption is Wissen is the most obvious, direct German equivalent to this English word knowledge. And so assuming that Geyer and Wood made this pairing, they had to choose a different English word for Erkenntnis. that's an understandable dilemma to face, and I think it also highlights the limitations of a word-for-word translation of this text, especially because Kant does not always use the same word with the same meaning, and Kemp Smith notes this in his commentary. And I think it's just really important to recognize that we have to pay attention to context to know what Kant means by a specific word. So I think it's helpful also at this point just to note some resources for understanding Kant. One is this Deutsches Wörterbuch by the Grimm brothers of Grimm's Fairy Tales. They have a German dictionary. I forget the exact year it was published, but I think it's helpful as a resource for understanding Kant's German because it's contemporary with Kant, more or less. It was certainly after Kant, but it's closer in time than we are, certainly. And it's also just wonderfully comprehensive. Someone can correct me here, but my understanding is that the Grimm's dictionary is somewhat analogous to the Oxford English Dictionary for the English language. So if we take a look here, what does Erkenntnis mean? I'm going to drop these into Google Translate just to make this very easy for us. So the first large group of meanings is insight, understanding. So knowledge, understanding, correct judgment, conclusion, result of an intellectual or scientific process. So does that match with cognition? I think of cognition as just kind of like thinking, like mental activity, but not as like correct judgment. Okay, that's A1. A2. Ability to perceive correctly, to understand. And this is helpful. A little bit of detail. Philosophically, in diverse and controversial discussions, the possibility of adequately grasping the world, of acquiring knowledge corresponding to reality, terminologically only since the 18th century. So comes online, in people like Kant. And 3. Recognition of a fact, insight into a given situation. Okay, that sounds more like cognition, but that seems different than this philosophical definition that we get in number 2. Recognition, identification, something like that. A4, yeah, recognition, identification, diagnosis. Okay, B. Oh, legal process, announcement. Okay, I don't think we need to worry about that too much. And C. Gratitude, acknowledgement of a debt of gratitude. That's quite interesting. It'd be interesting to explore those etymological relationships. But to my mind, all of this still pushes me back toward the idea that knowledge is just a much more helpful English equivalent for this German word, Erkenntnis. What does cognition mean? I actually have a dictionary here. This is the Oxford English Dictionary. Cognition. Close to my microphone. The action or faculty of knowing, knowledge, consciousness, acquaintance with a subject. In philosophy, the action or faculty of knowing, taken in its widest sense, including sensation, perception, conception, etc., as distinguished from feeling and volition. Okay, so that being the case, perhaps Geyer and Wood are vindicated. And this is just my subjective impression about the word cognition, because that definition fits quite well with the idea of knowledge. Anyway, all this background is just by way of providing context on some of these critical words, and also providing resources for how to take a deeper dive into a text like this. So it's nice to know that you have this Grimm's Wörterbuch available for free online, and that you can get a general sense of what some of these words mean. It's also helpful to know this corpora.org has the works of Kant available in German. So we can go over here. This is Vorrede, the preface. And here you see this word. Human knowledge has this special fate in one Gattung form of its knowledge, and so on. I'm not going to try to read German here on the fly. So if you want to know what a particular German word might be, you can go to this corpora.org, and you can use the Grimm's Wörterbuch to help you get a very detailed understanding of the meaning of some of these words. Okay, so that's it for background. I've already gone for quite a while. Let's jump into the preface to the first edition of Kant's first critique. This is the Kemp Smith translation, and we'll refer to Geyer and Wood as needed. Human reason has this peculiar fate, that in one species of its knowledge, it is burdened by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. I discussed this before, but just by way of brief comment, human reason is in this dilemma, which is that it has questions it can't help asking, which also go beyond what it's capable of finding out. The perplexity into which it thus falls is not due to any fault of its own. It begins with principles which it has no option save to employ in the course of experience, and which this experience at the same time abundantly justifies it in using. Rising with their aid, since it is determined to this also by its own nature, to ever higher, ever more remote conditions, it soon becomes aware that in this way, the questions never ceasing, its work must always remain incomplete. And it therefore finds itself compelled to resort to principles which overstep all possible empirical employment, and which yet seem so unobjectionable that even ordinary consciousness readily accepts them. But by this procedure, human reason precipitates itself into darkness and contradictions. And while it may indeed conjecture that these must be in some way due to concealed errors, it is not in a position to be able to detect them. For since the principles of which it is making use transcend the limits of experience, they are no longer subject to any empirical test. The battlefield of these endless controversies is called metaphysics. The basic idea here is that reason works well. To go back to this big distinction, big fundamental distinction between the empirical and the intelligible. Reason works well over here on the left side. And so it seems like no problem to just carry these over to this other realm. And there are nuances between these terms that we'll want to make, which make this, maybe not perfectly accurate. But he's saying it seems unobjectionable that reason's principles would carry over from the empirical realm, from the realm of experience, over to this intelligible realm of higher things, higher questions that reason can't help answering. But what happens is that when we do this, we get contradictions. And Kant spends a lot of this work explaining those contradictions and what their implications are. Let's keep going. Time was when metaphysics was entitled the queen of all the sciences. And if the will be taken for the deed, the preeminent importance of her accepted tasks gives her every right to this title of honor. Now, however, the changed fashion of the time brings her scorn. A matron outcast and forsaken, she mourns like Hecuba. Modo maxima rerum, tot generis natisque potens, nunc trahor exul inops. I don't know what that means off the top of my head. In the way of maxims, well, I have to come back to it. Her government, under the administration of the dogmatists, was at first despotic. This is also an important term, dogmatism versus skepticism, which he's about to mention. But inasmuch as the legislation still bore traces of the ancient barbarism, her empire gradually, through intestine wars, gave way to complete anarchy, and the skeptics, a species of nomads, despising all settled modes of life, broke up from time to time all civil society. Okay, so he's doing this metaphor. Metaphysics is this queen of the sciences, and at first, her realm is administered by the dogmatists, people who say these are the conclusions of metaphysics that have been reached through reason. We will teach them to you, and you just have to accept them. You don't need to understand them for yourself. Just accept the teachings of metaphysics dogmatically. This broke down and resulted in a swing to the opposite pole towards skepticism. Happily, the skeptics were few in number and were unable to prevent its being established ever anew, that is, metaphysics being established ever anew, although on no uniform and self-consistent plan. In more recent times, it has seemed as if an end might be put to all these controversies, and the claims of metaphysics receive final judgment through a certain physiology of the human understanding. Okay, now we're getting into the realm of empiricism, that of the celebrated Locke. This dream has not gone away. If you think about the project of neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, all of the empirical disciplines that engage with the human mind, this desire to explain what's going on with human beings on a physiological level has definitely remained. But it has turned out quite otherwise. For however the attempt be made to cast doubt upon the pretensions of the supposed queen by tracing her lineage to vulgar origins in common experience. Common experience is the starting point, and that's Locke, and also Kant will go there. This genealogy has, as a matter of fact, been fictitiously invented. Okay, so not quite. And she has still continued to uphold her claims. Metaphysics has accordingly lapsed back into the ancient time-worn dogmatism, and so again suffers that depreciation from which it was to have been rescued. So metaphysics is swinging back and forth between these poles of skepticism and dogmatism. And now, after all methods, so it is believed, have been tried and found wanting, the prevailing mood is that of weariness and complete indifferentism, the mother in all sciences of chaos and night, but happily in this case the source, or at least the prelude, of their approaching reform and restoration. For it at least puts an end to that ill-applied industry which has rendered them thus dark, confused, and unserviceable. But it is idle to feign indifference to such inquiries, the object of which can never be indifferent to our human nature. So people are exhausted by this process of swinging back and forth from dogmatism to skepticism, and eventually they just give up on the whole question and say, we don't care. But he says this indifference is feigned. And if you remember at the beginning, he said reason cannot help asking metaphysical questions. I think that's why he says the indifference is feigned. It's innate to human beings, to any rational creature, to want to ask these questions about realities that transcend our experience, the object of which can never be indifferent to our human nature. I think it's interesting just to note here that Kant does have a concept of human nature, and to remember our big distinction between empirical and intelligible. A lot of times he's talking about, when he talks about a rational creature, he's working in the realm of the intelligible. But he also has an empirical, anthropological understanding of human nature. It's just worth noting that, because I think Kant is typically seen as a thinker who's not really engaged with a concept like human nature. But I think the opposite is quite true. So indeed, these pretended indifferentists, however they may try to disguise themselves by substituting a popular tone for the language of the schools. Okay, so now he's kind of going after the public intellectuals. I'm not sure exactly who he has in mind, but inevitably fall back, insofar as they think at all, into those very metaphysical assertions which they profess so greatly to despise. So he's saying you can't avoid metaphysics even if you want to, even if you pretend to. Nonetheless, this indifference, showing itself in the midst of flourishing sciences and affecting precisely those sciences, the knowledge of which, if attainable, we should least of all care to dispense with, is a phenomenon that calls for attention and reflection. So why this indifference? It is obviously the effect not of levity, but of the matured judgment of the age, which refuses to be any longer put off with illusory knowledge. So people don't want knowledge that is fake. They want something real. It is a call to reason to undertake anew the most difficult of all its tasks, namely that of self-knowledge. So in the tradition of Socrates, know thyself, Kant is saying reason needs to know itself, and to institute a tribunal which will assure to reason its lawful claims and dismiss all groundless pretensions, not by despotic decrees, but in accordance with its own eternal and unalterable laws. Eternal and unalterable laws of reason. This tribunal is no other than the critique of pure reason. So Kant is saying he's going to critique, to analyze, to judge reason based on reason's own eternal and unalterable laws. He's going to use reason to help us know what reason is. That's the project. That's the project of this book. Okay, so the mature judgment of the age. He has a footnote on this. We often hear complaints of shallowness of thought in our age, and of the consequent decline of sound science. But I do not see that the sciences, which rest upon a secure foundation, such as mathematics, physics, etc., in the least deserve this reproach. On the contrary, they merit their old reputation for solidity, and in the case of physics, even surpass it. The same spirit would have become active in other kinds of knowledge if only attention had first been directed to the determination of their principles. So physics is doing well because the first principles are well established. The same is not necessarily true for other disciplines. Till this is done, indifference, doubt, and in the final issue, severe criticism, are themselves proofs of a profound habit of thought. Our age is, in a special degree, the age of criticism. And to criticism, everything must submit. Religion, through its sanctity, and law-giving, through its majesty, may seek to exempt themselves from it. but they then awaken just suspicion and cannot claim the sincere respect which reason accords only to that which has been able to sustain the test of free and open examination. We cannot respect something that has not been able to withstand this test of critique. Okay, so back to the main text. So he's going to tell us more about what he means by a critique of reason. I do not mean by this a critique of books and systems, but of the faculty of reason in general, in respect of all knowledge after which it may strive independently of all experience. Knowledge that is independent of experience. I think this is a nice gloss for what Kant means when he uses the word metaphysics. I'm just going to write this down. Sure, we'll put this here. There will be other ways that he describes it, but knowledge independent of experience. So it, by which he means this critique, will therefore decide as to the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics in general, and determine its sources, its extent, and its limits, all in accordance with principles. It's common to think or to say that Kant told us no more metaphysics. I don't think that's quite true. I think he wants to say, here's what metaphysics can be and can do. Here's what it can't. I have entered upon this path, the only one that has remained unexplored, and flatter myself that in following it, I have found a way of guarding against all those errors which have hitherto set reason in its non-empirical employment at variance with itself. I have not evaded its questions by pleading the insufficiency of human reason. On the contrary, I have specified these questions exhaustively, according to principles. So the questions that he mentioned at the beginning, that reason cannot help asking, Kant has laid them out exhaustively on his own understanding. And after locating the point at which, through misunderstanding, reason comes into conflict with itself, this is also very important. Kant proceeds by a method of analyzing contradictions. Interest in contradiction goes back to Aristotle, but as a philosophical method, it seems to me somewhat modern. This is sort of what we get in Descartes. We cannot assert I do not exist without contradicting ourselves, therefore we must exist. Identifying a contradiction and then inferring the truth of the opposite of that contradiction is a really important method philosophically that I think Kant is relying on heavily. And of course, I think this method continues to be important in someone like Hegel, very obviously. So after locating the point at which, through misunderstanding, reason comes into conflict with itself, I have solved them to its complete satisfaction. So he has resolved the questions by tracing them back to these points of contradiction and then showing a different way forward. The answer to these questions has not indeed been such as a dogmatic and visionary insistence upon knowledge might lead us to expect. That can be catered for only through magical devices in which I am no adept. Such ways of answering them are indeed not within the intention of the natural constitution of our reason. A dogmatic and visionary insistence upon knowledge. So he's saying, that's not me. That's magical. And that's not how reason works. Inasmuch as they have their source in misunderstanding, it is the duty of philosophy to counteract their deceptive influence. Deception is another important word in Kant's thought. has this idea of a deception of reason. Reason misleads itself in certain critical ways through illusions that are something like an optical illusion, where we place a stick in a stream, in a body of water, and it looks bent. Well, it's an illusion, but it's not an illusion that is a result of dysfunction. Our vision is working correctly, and part of the correct function of vision is that there are actually certain illusions, like an object placed in water is kind of distorted, or a rainbow is another illusion. These are valid parts of normal perception. And to anticipate, Kant thinks that reason also has these kinds of optical illusions or analogous illusions that are legitimate. They're not, they're part of the normal functioning of reason. But when it comes to the illusions of reason, we chase the rainbows because we think they're real, or we think the stick placed in the water is actually bent, because we can't test it against experience. So philosophy has this duty to counteract the deceptive influence of these dogmatic forms of knowing, no matter what prized and cherished dreams may have to be disowned. In this inquiry, I have made completeness my chief aim, and I venture to assert that there's not a single metaphysical problem which has not been solved. It takes some boldness to make a claim like that, or for the solution of which the key has not been supplied. Pure reason is indeed so perfect a unity that if its principle were insufficient for the solution of even a single one of all the questions to which it itself gives birth, we should have no alternative but to reject the principle. In other words, if we can't solve these problems, then we have to reject reason altogether. Uh-oh. There we are. Looks like I didn't have, looks like I wasn't on for a moment there. Okay. I'm not sure how long that was going on. I will continue. While I am saying this, I can fancy that I detect in the face of the reader an expression of indignation, mingled with contempt, at pretensions seemingly so arrogant and vainglorious. They are incomparably more moderate than the claims of all those writers who, on the lines of the usual program, profess to prove the simple nature of the soul or the necessity of a first beginning of the world. So he's saying, I'm not as pretentious as most people are in the metaphysical claims they wish to make. For while such writers pledge themselves to extend human knowledge beyond all limits of possible experience, metaphysics, I humbly confess that this is entirely beyond my power. I have to deal with nothing save reason itself and its pure thinking. And to obtain complete knowledge of these, there's no need to go far afield, since I come upon them in my own self. Echoes of Descartes here. He's saying, all I need to do is look into myself, and I can see the full field of what reason is capable of. Common logic itself supplies an example, how all the simple acts of reason can be enumerated completely and systematically. The subject of the present inquiry is the kindred question, how much we can hope to achieve by reason when all the material and assistance of experience are taken away. This goes back to this big distinction between the empirical and the intelligible. What happens when we strip away all the empirical? What's left to reason itself? So much as regards completeness in our determination of each question, and exhaustiveness in our determination of all the questions with which we have to deal. These questions are not arbitrarily selected. They are prescribed to us by the very nature of knowledge itself as being the subject matter of our critical inquiry. Okay, so up to this point, he's been talking about subject matter. Now he's going to talk about the form. This is another big distinction in Kant between form and matter, of course, resonant with Aristotle. As regards the form of our inquiry, certainty and clearness are two essential requirements, rightly to be exacted from anyone who ventures upon so delicate an undertaking. So, we must have certainty and clearness in this inquiry. As to certainty, I have prescribed to myself the maxim, a rule of behavior, that in this kind of investigation, it is in no wise permissible to hold opinions. Everything, therefore, which bears any manner of resemblance to an hypothesis is to be treated as contraband. No opinions, no hypotheses. It is not to be put up for sale, even at the lowest price, but forthwith confiscated immediately upon detection. Any knowledge that professes to hold a priori lays claim to be regarded as absolutely necessary. We should add this to the list. Necessary. Everything on this side of the intelligible is necessary. Everything over here is contingent, not necessary. This applies still more to any determination of all pure a priori knowledge, since such determination has to serve as the measure, and therefore as the supreme example of all apodictic philosophical certainty. Yeah, we can also add certainty. Necessary and certain. Contingent, uncertain. Not all things, just to get some, make a gap there. Not everything over here is opinion, but this is kind of the realm of opinion, whereas this is, I'm going to wait on that. I think that confuses the issue. He continues, whether I have succeeded in what I have undertaken must be left altogether to the reader's judgment. The author's task is solely to adduce grounds, not to speak as to the effect which they should have upon those who are sitting in judgment. But the author, in order that he may not himself innocently be the cause of any weakening of his arguments, may be permitted to draw attention to certain passages, which, although merely incidental, may yet occasion some mistrust. Such timely intervention may serve to counteract the influence which even quite undefined doubts as to these minor matters might otherwise exercise upon the reader's attitude in regard to the main issue. So he's going to mention some passages. I think this is a good stopping point. But let's read one more paragraph because then he's going to talk about clearness. So I know no inquiries which are more important for exploring the faculty, reason, which we entitle understanding. And he actually, that's another important distinction between reason and understanding. Vernunft is usually translated reason. Verstehen. Oh. Usually translated understanding. And these are importantly different. And for determining the rules and limits of its employment than those which I have instituted in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic, under the title Deduction of the Pure Concepts of Understanding. They are also those which have cost me the greatest labor, as I hope, not unrewarded. This inquiry, which is somewhat deeply grounded, has two sides. The one refers to the objects of pure understanding and is intended to expound and render intelligible the objective validity of its a priori concepts. It is therefore essential to my purposes. The other seeks to investigate the pure understanding itself. So objects of pure understanding versus pure understanding. No expectation that this will make sense at this point. Its possibility and the cognitive faculties upon which it rests, and so deals with it in its subjective aspect. And by subjective, Kant means having to do with the subject, but not subjective in the sense that it's idiosyncratic to each person. Although this latter exposition is of great importance for my chief purpose, it does not form an essential part of it. For the chief question is always simply this: what and how much can the understanding and reason know apart from all experience? Not how is the faculty of thought itself possible? The latter is, as it were, the search for the cause of a given effect. And to that extent is somewhat hypothetical in character, though as I shall show elsewhere, it is not really so. And I would appear to be taking the liberty simply of expressing an opinion, in which case the reader would be free to express a different opinion. For this reason, I must forestall the reader's criticism by pointing out that the objective deduction with which I am here chiefly concerned retains its full force, even if my subjective deduction should fail to produce that complete conviction for which I hope. On this matter, what has been said on pages 92 and 93 should in any case suffice by itself. Okay, that is heavy going. We covered a lot of ground. I'm going to stop there. We'll get on to his discussion of clearness next time. If you liked this and you want to see more, of course, subscribe and like and do all of those things. I'm also on Substack, Philosophy for Everyday Life. And coming up in May, I'm going to be holding an intensive. It will be 6 weeks. It will include weekly meetings, reading, discussion, and some sort of writing or reflection component. And it will be called Cultivating an Intellectual Life. So if you're interested in that, please use the link in the description to indicate your interest, and I will let you know when I have more details. If you've made it this far, thanks. I appreciate your time and attention, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.